This is the Lasgidi Farmer Podcast.
I begin with the special podcast today. Joining us, our team from Nofima, we have Sonesson, Mary Lillehammer, from the Norwegian Institute of Food, Fisheries and Aquaculture, right? So I'll basically run from the background to this. Catfish is one of the, or should I say, the most cultured fish species in Nigeria, and fish contributes nearly 50% of Nigeria's protein needs, right? But the problem is that we still have a supply gap of about 2.5 million metric tons, right? And the population of Nigeria by 2050 will be double to 400 million. So presently, the protein insecurity in Nigeria is about 50% of the population, right? So one of the leading causes for this is, the poor breed of fish that we have, poor breeding and inbreeding. So basically, if we are able to improve our breed, we could improve our supply, not only supply alone, but also enhance the livelihood of our farmers in such a way we eradicate malnutrition and also eradicate farmer poverty, right? So today we are looking at applying global best practices, obviously, from a global leading research institution like Nofima. And today we have Sonesson, who is the research director for the organization. And we also have Mary Lillehammer, also a senior researcher in the organization. So I'd just like to briefly go on with the first question of the day to both Anna and Mary. I want you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us what Nofima does in genetics and breeding technology. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thank you to him for inviting us to this podcast. This is the new format for me, more or less. So I lead the Department of Breeding and Genetics at Nofima. And Nofima is a food research institute in Norway. And we both work at the division Aquaculture, with speciality in genetics and breeding. And we have several fields that we specialized in. One is to optimize breeding programs in different ways. How to design them, which data to record on the individuals, and how to use it in the most optimal and cost-efficient way. So we work with very undeveloped industries, but we also work with a very highly developed salmon industry here in Norway, for example. Yeah, and we work a lot in at the global scene as well, with tropical species also. And our breeding is a technique that you can utilize for most species. So it's just a matter of defining which one you want to start on. So we hope that we can work a bit with catfish in Nigeria in the future. I think that is it from me.
Yes,
so thank you.
Yes, my name is Marie Lillehammer, and as already mentioned, I'm a senior researcher in Nofima. I've been working with Nofima for 17 years, and primarily with design and optimization of breeding programs, both in Norway but also globally, and a large variety of species, both low trophic species and various fish species, setting up brand new breeding programs and also to optimize and improve existing breeding programs is my specialty.
Okay, thank you for that brief introduction. Really appreciate that. So we just have to go into the conversation, and I will direct this question to Hannah. I'd like to ask, about genetics itself. Why genetics matter so much in fish farming? What happens when we ignore it, especially in African catfish? Many believe fish farming is just a game of feeding and the right environment. Could you enlighten us on that? Thank you.
Yeah. So what we do in selective breeding is that we utilize genetic variation that is available in the populations that we are producing, and we use this genetic variation to improve them in directions that are beneficial. They can have economic benefits, for example, growth, so that you have a shorter production cycle. But it can also target traits like disease resistance, so that we get less mortality in our production, or it can target the quality, that we get better quality of the product for the farmer to sell and for the consumer to eat. So that's let's say the main aim. But we also need to control the rates of inbreeding. That's the second thing that has to be in place for a good breeding program to run. And we can do that at different levels. Just setting up a pedigree, or we can use genomic markers that we do today. So if not using it, I think we can say that you're missing out on an important tool that could have been used to improve competitiveness of the Nigerian farmers. It's important to remember that selective breeding is a long-term activity. So you get, typically we get something like 5 to 10% gain per generation, and this accumulates over time. So, and that is for production or growth rate kinds of traits that have a quite high heritability, and we can measure on the candidates. But if you want to set up a breeding, you have to remember that it is a long-term commitment. It's not something that you go in and change all the time, or you just do on a small scale. It's a long-term, big-scale operation, knowledge-intensive as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah, for that. I want to ask you a follow-up question to that, talking about the importance of global genetics and technology. Like to ask you, from Nofima's global experience, why is it important for countries like Nigeria to learn, from and apply advanced genetics and breeding technologies? Thank you.
Yeah, so the good thing with breeding is that the techniques or the philosophy is the same. We improve traits that we want to improve, and we control rates of inbreeding. That's the basics for all the species. So we can adapt it to the problems or the potential that you have with your populations here, and that we have some experience in that in our department for different species that I mentioned. So the reason why you should try to get it up and running in Nigeria is that you're losing out on a very, very potent method, but that needs skills to utilize.
Thank you for that, and it's really quite important that we can apply global best practices technology to help us address inbreeding, because if we can do that, then we can improve our fish species. We can also improve our productivity and outcome as well, and not only just this, it makes us up to par with the rest of the world, right? Improving our exports, foreign earnings, and the like. So I move on to the next question, and this question I'd like to address it to you and Mary, but I would like Mary to go first with this. We've been highlighting inbreeding since our conversation, inbreeding depression, but what exactly is it? So I'd like to ask, what is inbreeding depression? How does this typically manifest in fish? Does it vary from fish to fish? Why could it be a big eating problem for Nigerian catfish farmers, because we are applying it to catfish here? I'd like to hear from both of you. Anna, your work entails genetic variation management, and Mary, you have worked with several species. Thank you.
Yes, so inbreeding depression happens if an individual, or if the parents of an individual are closely related, and it can cause a number of problems. Typically, we can see reduced growth, reduced survival, increased frequency of deformities, reduced fertility, and it may appear in different species, and it may vary from species to species how severe it is and which symptoms you see. When looking at Nigerian catfish, the populations, especially within farms, have been documented to be severely inbred. There's documentation that if you mate two random fish from the same farm, it may be like mating a pair of siblings, because the whole farm population is so closely related to each other. And this could be of course, the cause of a lot of problems seen in African catfish, but this is not properly documented that the problems is caused by inbreeding, so that needs some further research to see if that is really the problem or to document that that is the problem. But the combination that the inbreeding level is documented and you experience a lot of problems with the fish could indicate that you struggle with inbreeding depression. The good news is that there seems to be a lot of genetic variation between farms. So you do have genetic variation in your population. If you manage to mix stocks from several farms, that could be a possible solution to this.
Thank you. Anna, you want to go on that as well?
Yeah, well, if you're going to set up a breeding program, you have to make sure that you start with fish from many origins. Now, that's just to follow up what Marie was talking about, because there is genetic variation out there. I think that's also what the studies show, and then you need to have tools to manage the inbreeding. So that's probably might have gone wrong in the Nigerian catfish production. That you actually didn't control how fast the inbreeding was increasing, because inbreeding is unavoidable if you have a closed population. The easiest way to control inbreeding is to use many parents in the breeding program. They can come from different batches or so, but you should not start with a too small base population. And the second thing, or advancement, or how do you say it, is to actually set up a pedigree to more identify the fish using some kind of ID tags on them and set up an old-fashioned pedigree. And later you can start to use more fancy genomic markers, either at a very small marker panel where you use a small number to set up the same kind of information, but in retrospect compared to what you get from a normal pedigree. Or you can start to use more whole genomic information using SNP array tools. Then you get a more accurate relationship between individuals. But the number one, I think, for Nigerian development right now is to make sure that if you start, that you have a good base population with a good size there. Would you like to add something there, Maria, to that?
No, I think you covered it well. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria and Hannah, for that, explaining inbreeding depression, mating closely related species, and many of the symptoms. Many farmers do not know it or consider it as inbreeding, and you've mentioned quite a number of that. Reduced growth, reduced survival, reduced fertility. But you have offered option. The good news, glad tidings that actually expanding, increasing, the breeding population could help to, reduce the incidence of inbreeding. But I was just looking at the species that we have in Nigeria, or that we farm in Nigeria, just basically three: the Clarias, gariepinus, Heterobranchus bidosadi, and Heterobranchus niloticus. Just a few species. Even if we are sort of, develop a lot of offspring from them, we might still encounter inbreeding. But I don't want to deliberate on that for long. I just, want to move on to the next question to Anna. But before that, we have quite a number of listeners in the house. Thank you for joining us. If you join us recently, we are having a discussion on how to apply global best practices in advanced genetics and technology to improve, fish breeding in Nigeria from the perspective of Nofima. That's the Norwegian Institute of Food, Fisheries and Aquaculture. And we have their leading professionals in the house, Anna Sonesson, the research director, and Mary Lillehammer, a senior researcher in the organization. So if you're having any question, you can use the hand icon to indicate, or you can send in your question as a chat. We will always address that during the course of the conversation. Right. So I move on to the next question. Anna, if you are ready with me, Anna, you design breeding schemes using marker-assisted and genomic selection. Now let's look at the nature of hatchery in Nigeria here. Is usually small to medium, and many times they do not have access to these advanced technology. So I want to ask you that what would a realistic breeding scheme look like for a small to medium catfish hatcheries in Nigeria?
Here are many things to say. So first of all, when you set up a breeding program, you have to decide how you're going to do the pedigree, as I just mentioned. Are you going to set up old-fashioned pedigree and identify the individuals using external tags, or it can be the internal tags as well, or are you going to use genomic resources? So if you choose the first one, then that's typical for aquaculture. We need to wait until the species have reached a certain size before we can mark them, and then that affects the design of the breeding program. It means that you need to have specialized tanks where you keep the families separate for a longer period. If you choose, and then you can tag them, and you have a group of selection candidates that you can select the parents for next generation on. The second version is that you merge individuals from families at much earlier stage, maybe before hatching even, and you raise them in probably a bit larger numbers, because here you can then utilize, it's a numbers game, but anyway, you keep them separate, and then you pre-select them at several phases, and at a certain point you say, okay, now we should start the real final selection of the parents. Then you take out and identify them. You take a tissue sample and genotype them, either for markers that you can later calculate genomic breeding values on, and you can get genomic relationships, and you select the best parents. So it gives quite a different design if you choose the first version, where you keep them separately much longer. You need to have higher investment cost in your breeding program facilities, but you have better control. As soon as you want to set up a test fish group using the same families, it's very easily done. You make some parallel groups of populations that you have in this candidate group, and you get very good information and high accurate breeding values. The other one, where you use the genomic information, you have less investment cost, but you need, on the other hand, then to genotype many more individuals. So, and genotyping costs are going down. It's always a big negotiation issue for the breeding programs with the genotyping providers. But we have, even in Atlantic salmon, we have both of these varieties going on, and they both work. There are two types of breeding programs. Was there a question here before I go on? I cannot.
The question is saying that, could you explain what genomic information is?
Yeah, I can do that. We are talking about genetic marker information that we have over the whole genome of the individual. So we take a tissue sample and we extract DNA, and then we have made some presets of markers that we genotype all the individuals for. So it's like a gene variants. They are spread over the genome. They're not particularly, the effects of them for the traits that we select for is not necessarily known, but we want to have the whole genome represented when we do this selection. So it's not that we have had to identify big genes or anything. Often we don't have genes that are identified for traits like growth. Yeah. Okay. So we have. Was that okay? Was that clearer? Mohimi? Yeah. Yes. So we have these two big distinctions on the breeding program. We have a specialized breeding program that work only with breeding. That's another distinguishing here. So they select seeds to the producers. Other companies have the breeding inside, and they have the dissemination inside their company. So it's like integrated breeding and production activity. That has the advantage in that you have, or immediately access to very good individuals for your production, and it also means that you have some logistics, because you need both to look at which individuals are you going to use for the breeding, which are you going to use for dissemination at the producer level. Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about the role of government and these things, who is going to own the breeding program, because often when we talk about the design here, we need to have some infrastructure up and going. And in many cases, this infrastructure can come from if there's not enough money in the private small industry sector. It's typically something that the government can provide. They typically provide infrastructure on the hatchery, and a bit later on the younger stage before they are sold out. But the government has a second very important role here, and that is to take away risk from the often quite vulnerable smaller farmers. So if the government is actually taking that risk in these long-term programs, they have a much higher chance of surviving. This is called public-private partnership, and it has worked for breeding programs here in Norway, and I think there are also other examples out in the world. We have the GIFT program. It started with big funding from international sources, and now these populations have been relocated to several private partners. Yeah, I think that was what I wanted to say on this part. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Anna. I really enjoyed that, and thank you so much for taking us to the two different breeding programs, right? And as well, I love that you chip in the part of the government, the ownership of the process, how to actually develop this, right? So when you look at Nigeria, a case study, for example, you've got a good breeding program going for chicken, going for ruminants, going for plants, new varieties, new breeds released, from time to time in the last 2 decades. But when it's catfish or fish, you seldom get that, except for tilapia with the genetically improved farm, fish. But for catfish, it's not that. We only have just 3 species, and they are from the 90s, no new species. So it sort of baffled me, because we have over 65 species in the wild in Nigeria. When you look at Africa, over 1,000, and also in the world, it gets more. So if you are able to exploit this diversity, we could use it to improve, a fish breed. But the problem is that who is going to undertake that? Obviously, the small, medium hatcheries are not able to undertake that themselves, looking at the resources, the technical requirements and all that, right? So it's good that you touched on that. So we delve into the technology part, and shortly we can start taking, questions. If you're having any question, please start sending them in. So for my technology question is going to go to, Mari, considering your engagement with diverse array of fish farming technologies, I'd like to ask you, what practical technologies or tools can small to medium Nigerian hatcheries start using to improve, their breeding? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So Anna already mentioned several benefits of using genomic information. It means you take a DNA sample of the fish, and you can use that to estimate the actual relationship between each fish. And this is a very useful tool for breeding, and maybe especially for aquaculture, because fish are typically difficult to tag physically. So we have several examples that this have improved and made it easier to run good breeding programs for fish and aquaculture species. We need to remember still that it's not strictly essential to run a breeding program. In agriculture, we run breeding program for centuries before we discovered the genomic information. So to select the good breeding animals and to manage inbreeding, it's not built on these novel genomic tools. The tools just makes it a bit easier and available to us. So what is essential is to keep track of who is who, right? To be able to manage inbreeding and also to get good estimates of breeding values, you need to know the ID of your fish. So for African catfish, it has been developed genomic tool for parentage assignment. And this is a version where they have discovered specific markers that are useful to establish who is the father and mother of this fish. So you can easily test your fish and figure out if they are closely related, if they are sibs, if they share one or two parents. So that can be a very useful tool for managing inbreeding. And because it's developed this way, it is more affordable than other genomic options when you use only a few designated markers that work for this. And it's also developed genomic tools to distinguish between different catfish species, which is obviously also important if you're unsure which species you're working with. So you do have options for African catfish, and they can definitely be useful. And maybe the most useful short-term applicants is to make sure to manage inbreeding well, because it might be actually the easiest way of keeping track of the relationship between your fish without building very special infrastructure to keep the fish apart and also develop good tagging systems.
Oh, great. Thank you for that, Mari. Really appreciate. And so would be opening up the floor for question now, just briefly. If you've got questions, you can send them in. I'm having quite a number of participants here. Moimi Glory will send in the first question. Thank you. If you've got any question now, there's opportunity to open the mic and speak. Kasim Jubri, Otushola, Peter, Rashidat, Timothy are waiting for your question. And also just to remind you that this conversation has been recorded. If you have missed any part of it, you could always, re-listen to it. I've dropped a link in the chat session to follow the Lasgidi Farmer podcast on Spotify. You can always re-listen to that. Okay, I'm having something for Peter Aswilimen. Good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. All right, Peter, have you got any question for host? Anna, you want to take on that?
Yeah, I think aquaculture is very advanced. We have to, however, we have to adapt them to the species that we work with. But maybe we have a bit better knowledge about the genes in other farm species, etc. But to use genomics and genetic techniques in breeding, it's actually very much advanced. They're quite easily to transfer technologies to different species, because a genome is basically a genome. Of course, this is a very rough statement, but it's easy to identify genetic markers that can be used in all the species that we work on. Yeah, in Nigeria, no, I have understood that I think you're right there. There isn't a modern breeding program for catfish in Nigeria, as far as I know. But that is something we could work on.
Yeah, obviously. I think we could work on that. And I came across some research recently. I think it's sponsored by the World Fish Organization. And there was a leading doctor that sought to spearhead that research, where I think Dr. Suleiman Issa, researching on improving the catfish strain. Yeah. But obviously, we have to improve in Nigeria, adapt global best practices. And if you were with us from the beginning, this has been our deliberation. So like I said, this conversation is being recorded and you can always have access to that. So I'll move on to the next question. Mari, are you ready for me?
Yes, I'm ready. Yes.
So let's talk about optimizing breeding programs. Mari, you focus on optimizing breeding programs. So I'd like to ask you that what kind of improvements in growth or survival can farmers realistically expect if they manage their breeding stock better?
Yeah. So if we look globally to other fish breeding program or aquaculture breeding program, as Anna already mentioned, it's possible to achieve like a 5 to 10% improvement in gain per generation in growth-related traits. So if you do the math from there, it means that if you run like 10 generations of breeding, you may double your growth rate. So that sounds very promising. That really makes a difference. The 10 generations take some time. So again, this is long-term work where you start and you gradually improve your stock from generation to generation to be better and better. And the key word to achieve that is a well-managed population. To be able to do selection every generation, priority number one is to manage inbreeding and make sure that you sustain the genetic variation in your population. And yes, in addition to growth, there's also a number of other traits that may be included, like survival robustness traits. We have very good results towards like resistance to specific diseases for both shrimp, salmon, and other fish. So, and also product quality. So if you set up a program that is well managed, that holds a lot of genetic variation, and you make sure to take care of your genetic variation and manage inbreeding as well as systematic selection, you can achieve a very considerable genetic gain in the long run. And you get this gain from two different perspectives. So first, just managing the inbreeding itself will reduce the problems you might have with inbreeding depression, as we discussed at the very start of this conversation, right? So as soon as you build your genetic variation and you avoid to mate close relatives, you might already win that you don't have to deal with inbreeding depression. And then secondly, when you add systematic selection for key economically important traits, then you get the genetic gain, which accumulates over generations. And as long as you manage to run this a sustainable and systematic way, you can keep on for many generations. And every generation, you get a gain which comes on top of what you already had achieved the last time. You keep all of it forever. So that's how it works when you manage to set it up correctly.
Thank you, Mari. That is not just a one-time thing to achieve. It's going to be over time, right? And, just stay with me. I'd like to ask you a follow-up conversation on that. And I think that this part, I want the fish farmers to listen carefully, because it's going to be practical, adaptable insight to use on your farms and start seeing real-time benefits, real-time impact, productivity improvement, right? So maybe I'd like to ask you, what are the most important general genetic principles that hatchery farmers should know? How can these principles be adapted specifically to African catfish farming in Nigeria? Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, for a trait to be improved by selective breeding, it is the trait needs to be heritable. It needs to be inherited from the parents to offspring. So it needs to have a genetic component. There are genes controlling this trait. And most traits are influenced both by genetics and other factors. If we think about growth, for instance, usually a new breeding program will start focusing on growth. Growth is easy to measure. It is heritable for all, or at least most species, and it has a very intuitive economic relevance. So it's a very typical place to start. And if we look into growth, we know that a large parent will, as a main rule, give large offspring. So this is heritable. It's inherited from parents to offspring. But we also know that there are lots of factors affecting growth, like access to feed, competition with other fish, health status, etc. So to select the largest fish in your group, it does not mean that you select the fish with the highest genetic growth potential. You have to make sure that what you measure is telling something about the genetics of the fish. So if you select the largest fish, which is much larger than the others, you might unintentionally select for cannibalistic behavior, for instance, which was not your scope, which was not what you were aiming for. So step one, in a way, is to investigate how can I measure the trait I'm looking for in such a way that the genetics become visible, that I'm sure that what I'm selecting for is a genetic potential for this trait and not just how the trait is displayed in the fish. So this could mean that you need to measure growth under specific conditions where other factors are very standardized, or a specific time of life where you see that the genetic potential is more important than other factors. So when working with new species, we usually use a lot of effort into finding good ways of measuring traits to kind of reveal the genetics behind the trait, to reveal which fish has the highest genetic potential for this trait. So, and also here, pedigree is useful. It's not only useful to manage inbreeding, it's also useful if you see that lots of relatives have large growth. It means that this is probably genetic. This is something they have inherited from their common parents. So we have advanced statistical tools to put the pedigree information together with the phenotypic information to estimate which fish should be selected as a parent, like which fish has the best genetic potential. So I see there's also a question about an example. We're measuring growth at a specific time of life. We do have an example from fish where we see that when fish goes into sexual maturation, growth is increased a lot. So if we measure growth at a point where the fish is entering sexual maturation, we don't really select for growth potential, we select for early sexual maturation. While if we select earlier, before any of the fish has gone into sexual maturation, we can better reveal the growth potential of each single fish. That is one example.
Would that be her, Mari?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mari, for that insightful submission. Really, appreciate that. And, you touch on something significant. There are a lot of farmers, when they raise fish and they see the biggest fish in the pond, they say, okay, we are going to use this for breeding. So it does not necessarily say, it does not necessarily say that is the best fish breed. It might actually be a result of carnivorous tendency, right? And when I did my carousel on, eradicating fish inbreeding, I mentioned or discourage not using shooters. Shooters are rapidly growing fish among the stock, right? So I would direct my next question to Anna, but I want Mari to, also contribute to this. Anna, when we talk about all this improving of fish breed, is usually that we talk about inbreeding, mating closely related species, but the other side that is not being talked about is the hatchery practices and management itself, right? Where we have escapes from our hatcheries. You have fish that you've bred, to grow rapidly, then going into the white, to mix with the white there, possibly polluting the pure gene pool, right? So my next question would be that how can Nigeria hatcheries, balance the use of local and wide genetic diversity with improved domesticated strains without causing ecological risks?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't really think that it has to matters what you start up with your breeding program regarding this risk, because the risk is actually on that you domesticate the fish in such a way that it will probably not have the highest fitness in the wild anymore. At the same time, we don't even want hybridization with wild species, wild individuals. This is very important that we try to limit the SKP. So I think there are two different problems here. One is what you actually start with. If you start with a local or a important seed, I don't think that really matters here. The important thing that you should focus on is to have biosecurity in your system, that they cannot escape here. And that is a risk. We just have to minimize it. We have seen in Norwegian salmon industry where the farmers actually have to report every single escaped fish that they see. And with measures, we see that the escaping has really dramatically decreased over time, because many of these escapee events are due to human errors. So this is part of developing a sustainable system. And as any human activity, we want to reduce the risk on the environment as much as we can. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna, for that. I like that, you mentioned the importance of biosecurity, but the biosecurity action itself is going to be the action of every farmer, right? And I like that you mentioned that it might not be deliberate, or it might be due to error. Like in some farms, maybe the pond level is lower than the land, and when you have torrential rainfall, flood, it comes, washes the fishes away. In that way, you have escapes in exodus, right? So, Mary, have you got an addition to this part of the conversation?
Yes, I think Anna mentioned the most important thing, that yes, when you have domesticated fish, you should prevent it from escaping into the wild. And the reason is that populations are adapted all the time. So the wild fish is adapted to a life in the wild. When we take wild fish and we domesticate it, when we select the fast growers in the farmed environment, it means we are adapting the fish to a farmed environment. And no matter where you started, no matter the origin of this fish, after some generations of adaptation, this fish will be less suited to live in the wild. And that's why it is a problem when it escapes and mixes with the wild. It might make the wild stock less adapted to the wild environment. So the wild stock will have to readapt to its home. And that is a problem that we should be aware of when we keep domesticated animals that are still capable of mating with wild relatives, that we try to keep them inside the facilities. And of course, it's not deliberate when they escape. No one will farm fish to let it escape. You don't get paid also for the escaped fish. So, but it's important to keep that in mind, that it's also to make sure to maintain the environment around you.
Yeah, so Mary, I'd like to ask you, you're talking about the mating of farm fish and the wild fish. Is it really realistic that we have something like this? You have bred this fish, hybridized, and done all sorts of things to improve the traits, adjust it and all that. Could there not be a sort of change in chromosomes and the key for mating that actually prevent this sort of hybridization in the wild when there's escape?
So we do have a lot of data from salmon in Norway, and we see that the spawning success of farmed escapees are very, also, first of all, the survival of farmed escapees is very low. So if the fish escaped at a young age, it's unlikely that it will get mature in the wild. But if it escaped close to sexual maturation, so it's already alive at the time of going into sexual maturation, it might find the spawning grounds and the wild relatives. The spawning success of such a farmed escapee is approximately a third or a fourth to a wild, but that doesn't mean that it cannot happen. Especially if you have large escapes, sometimes we have in rivers in Norway, when we have a large escape, we have found equally many farmed and wild fish in the river. So it means that the farmed fish are in a big number, and then even though their individual spawning success is low, some of them will manage to mix with the wild relatives. And that means that we produce young fish with reduced survival and reduced spawning success. So they might not manage themselves to sexual maturation than the next generation. So thereby the nature is kind of cleaning up this problem itself. But in the meantime, we might have fewer fish in that population because we produce fish that are not adapted to life in the wild.
I mean, it could go both ways, Mari. We could say that the escapees may not survive. And what if they survive? And especially in this case of catfish that are highly carnivorous and can be voracious eaters. We've seen many a case where introduced invasive species, wiped out native species. We don't want a case like this. So it's why we have to get back to what Anna has encouraged us to, adopt biosecurity. Biosecurity is very important. Anna, I see that you raise your hand. Have you got something to say?
No, just one additional thing here, and that is that, of course, it helps if you don't have mature fish in the ponds, that they grow so fast that they never reach maturation. It will help. Of course, if they escape, they can still mature, but just to make sure that you don't at least have mature fish in the ponds is one way of reducing this problem.
Okay, so Anna, my next question will go to you. We've got young and brilliant individuals listening to us here, and you could see the caliber of questions that we are entertaining. Peter, Imoimi, and some others that may not be able to ask now, but perhaps what we are saying is addressing a pinpoint, a gap, a question for them, right? So I'd like to ask what your advice would be for these individuals who are seeking a career in the seeking or pursuing a career in the fishery and aquaculture space. I'd like to ask you, what role can capacity building and training play in helping these Nigerian farmers adopt better genetic practices?
Well, of course, it's very important to have education here. Breeding is a very knowledge-intensive field. You need to know about the biology of the fish. You need to know something about genetics as such and how genetics affects the look of the fish. And you need to have knowledge about the breeding methodology as such. So without some education, I think it's very difficult to run a breeding program. But of course, there's also lots of experience with the populations that we don't have. So we can come in and help with the breeding, but the biology of the fish, it must come from the locals in Nigeria. So there are, you can take any kind of education in selective breeding and then later apply it to selective breeding. It doesn't have to necessarily have to be focused on aquaculture, I believe, because the same principles hold. We have had 2 students from Nigeria working here with us, so we know that there are possibilities to get some education. Then there are online courses. There are big famous universities around the world where you can sign in for. Some experience we have when we come up to a doctorate level is that we have sandwich model, it's called, where part of the education is taken in this case Nigeria, and some of it here will be taken here in Norway. So for example, we would help you to analyze local data. Then you go back and get the data at home and come, and we help you to analyze it and to apply, give you advice on how to apply it. Then you go back and do it there, things like that. So I, of course, hope that you are interested in this very interesting field. It is very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that. We've got a question in the comment section, but we'll take it shortly after this. Mari, I hope you are prepared for me. This question is regarding the building sustainable breeding programs. You said it in the past that it's not just a one-time thing. It's something that has to be done over time, right? So I'd like to ask you, what have successful long-term breeding programs taught us globally? How can similar structured approaches be implemented in Nigeria?
Yes, so I think we have covered many of these aspects already about that. You need to combine inbreeding management with systematic selection. I would build on something Anna mentioned, that this is knowledge intensive and so it is probably not realistic that every single farmer should hold the required infrastructure and competence and capacity to run a breeding program. There needs to be some kind of cooperation or a company running the breeding program and a good dissemination system so that this improved stock is made available to a number of farmers and not only the one hosting the program. And when we look globally, we see, as Anna also mentioned before, that most successful breeding programs, they have been subsidized in the start to minimize the risk of starting up by governments or by research funds or by private funding organizations, so that it's possible to start up. Because since this is a long-term thing, when you start it, you have to make a lot of investments, you have to use a lot of money to get started, and it takes a while because you get this return back. So I think it's important to set up corporations and models so that this is accessible for farmers without every single farmer needing to hold this competence and other resources needed.
Okay. So what Anna is saying, if I understand that better, is a breeding program is not for everyone, but there should be favorable environment for the government to enable the establishment of that, subsidy. And Anna has said or gave us an example of what works, private participation, right? So I hope we are taking that into consideration. So my next question goes to, Anna, looking at the future of African aquaculture. I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope about the future of genetics and breeding technology for African aquaculture?
Yeah, of course, there are very big hopes for this. You have a huge industry. It's really, really huge. And I think with a relatively small change, you can start to improve part of the whole production that you already have. I think the most tricky part is to set up this business model where you probably would like to have some kind of governmental in the basics. Then you need some big, probably influential farmers to join such a consortia. So I think to get that and set up good dissemination plans for it. But of course, it's possible. It's been done many, many places. So I really hope you are able to start with it. And remember, you don't start with a Ferrari. You start with in a small scale. You start something that you can handle, and you build out from that when the needs are coming or when the possibilities are there. So starting the small is a good thing. It's very much okay. It's better to do a little than nothing. That citation from Trygve Gjedrem, who started the whole salmon adventure here in Norway. I think it's a very wise saying. You cannot just build up, we need to know this and know this before you do anything, because time is running, the generation intervals are long also for this species, so it takes time to build it up. So it's better to do a little bit. Yeah.
Great, Anna. That was thoughtful advice there. Starting small and scaling up. And I very happy and glad that you are confident and have a good view of the opportunities for the African aquaculture. And for me as well, I see a lot of potential opportunities considering our population reaching 400 million in 2050. And that when you look at that population itself, is significantly formed by young people who require protein and fish and all that, right? And I'd like to advise farmers in the house today that we should not be seeing it as a challenge, but as an opportunity to actually do something, make money, expand the livelihoods, grow the economic activities, export, trapping income, realize foreign earnings, right? But of course, this wouldn't happen without the favorable environment and without the government actually setting the roadmap for private sector participation and ease of entrance of small producers like we have, right? I move on to the final question. I think we did well on time. We set 1 hour for this conversation, and we have used just 6 minutes extra. Pardon me, Mary, and so sorry for that. But after this last question, I would like you to address a question in the comment section. It has been sitting there. Remind me, your question is recognized. We are still coming to that. Anna, you were giving advice to the young people here, but I still want you to expand on that. And I want Mary to be a part of this, asking that what advice would you give to young Nigerian students or farmers who want to work in aquaculture genetics? So just to get into a bit of your profile, I'm trusting that there will be rich thoughts here. Anna, you've been in the field for 24 years now, having earned your PhD in 2002 after concluding MSc in 1996. I'm married with a focused PhD in breeding and genetics and being a research scientist in quantitative genetics with Nofima for almost 2 decades. I think this answer that you are going to give is going to help us, buffer local capacity to improve fish breeds in Nigeria and Africa. I'd love to hear from you both. Thanks.
Education, I think, is the short answer.
Yes, I agree. It's very important to learn. It's very important to gain knowledge and to cooperate with knowledgeable people.
Yes, search for a scholarship at the university to learn about quantitative genetics. That's one basic skill. It's always good to have some skills in the fish biology. And you have to have some knowledge of the surrounding areas, such as nutrition and disease resistance and production system. But it can also be very fine to just be specialist in the other things you learn on the way. So that's maybe something you should think about, how broad and how specialistic you want to become. If you really like calculations and statistical analysis and data, then quantitative genetics and bioinformatics is a super field, I would like to say. It's very, very interesting. We try to extract useful information from huge data sets. It's very, very interesting, and develop new methods to get this data out, this information out of the data.
I mean, this is what we are having here right now is part of it, a good step in the right direction. Is part of the education that you are saying fish farmers, players in this space, getting to connect with research director, researchers, senior researchers in the space, and you get to enlighten us, right? Adapting global best practices and also advanced genetics and technology. And here we are also using technology to converse on the virtual space. So we do really, appreciate this, trusting that it's going to be deeply impactful and strengthen our local technical capacity in addressing and improving our fish breed. So I will go to the comment section now to address the last question. Moimi is saying that, can you share ways to identify and measure fecundity and fertility of female and male parent stock in population? Emphasis on physical examination, as a lot of farmers have no access to laboratories or research institutes. A lot of farmers talk about the color of the eggs. I hope you can able to, help us with that shortly.
Yeah, I'm not expert in this. So now you already took me on this. What do we actually know? But what I do know is that there are 2 important tools that are used for fecundity work in fish. One is the ultrasound, where you see if the fish has started to become sexually mature, and that is the tool you apply on the outside of the fish. That can be very important. You then know which ones that you think will mature and you can use for your breeding for the coming batch or not. And the second one is these egg sorters. They are very good. They have light systems and to see which eggs are actually dead. And they look at color and things, I think, also to identify the best eggs. But to do it without any kind of tool, I'm not sure, actually. I think that here at least they use not extremely complicated machines, but I don't think it's done only from human visual inspection, as far as I know.
Mary, have you got something on that?
No, I think this is very species specific. So you have to know the biology of your species. And then when it comes to catfish, I am absolutely not an expert. So I have no good ideas or knowledge about how to evaluate that now.
No, sorry for that. But so these are the things. I have to ask questions, find information, improve things. That's for you, for all of you, if you work in the sector. So very good, very good. What was your name? Himi. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for today's knowledge and everything that you've helped us with. Anna, Mary, it's been deeply educative, insightful. If there's any other word that I can use for it, and I thank the participant as well. For joining us. Afola Shade, Moimi Kazim, Odushola, Peter, Rashidat, Adam Malik. Let's just keep the flag flying like you've heard. The advice from our speakers today is to seek more education, be open to knowledge, right? Apply for scholarship and all that. Institute appropriate biosecurity, form cooperation. You might not be able to establish a breeding program yourself, but you can be able to source good breeds from a corporation of individuals that have done deliberate work to improve fish breed. This is the way that we can actually follow to improve our fish breed, right? And I hope that you've been able to also get knowledge on inbreeding, the homozygosity, crossing related species, why you have to use a large number of breeding mates, right, and many other things. But assured that this conversation is being recorded, and you would have future access to it. Thank you all for joining us today. And before I bid a farewell, I was having conversation with Mary and Anna and another colleague, Ingrid. Thank you, Ingrid, for facilitating this conversation. Currently I'm conducting a fish campaign in Lagos, which is the improved. I've been interviewing farmers and getting a lot of information and all that. So I was thinking if there could be like a virtual training. This is just a conversation, virtual training of farmers that were evaluated to actually support them, if you are open to that. What do you think, Anna and Mary? Sorry to put you on the spotlight.
No, it's fine. Training is good, of course.
Without much ado, I would proceed to ending the conversation. If you've got any other final submission, Anna and Mary, you could leave it before I close the conversation.
No, just contact us or directly or to him if you don't find our contact information, and we really like questions, so thank you so much, and good luck. It's very good to ask questions. Ask for improved when you buy. If one of you is buying catfish, ask the provider, has this what's the origin of this population? Has it been selectively improved for something? Create a demand.
All right. Okay.
Good luck and to all of you. It's been very nice to be here.
I think that will be all. Good luck. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.